Hello and welcome to our first panel of the Techlandia Summit 21, Opportunities and Challenges Using Digital Technologies to Improve Agriculture Supply Chain. I'm Kara Toronto, Chief Operating Officer with the Technology Association of Oregon, and I'll be your facilitator of this session along with Riley O'Brien, Vice President, Events and Experiences, who will be coordinating back-end support. We're delighted to have you join us for a conversation about the use of digital technologies to improve productivity, efficiency of field operations, and farming practices based on increased data coverage and comprehensive information. We had a global kickoff this morning from SAP's agribusiness, and I'm really excited to bring this back down to the local level. A couple of rules of engagement before we start. All of our participants have been muted. Please remain on mute unless the TAO staff member unmutes you and calls on you to talk. It's just to eliminate the sounds of barking dogs and garbage trucks, which we all know have happened during the last 15 months. You can ask a question or respond to a question in the chat publicly or privately by directing your messages to me, or I think maybe it's either TAO admin or special events. And we're going to monitor the chat box and respond throughout the discussion, as well as collect those questions for the end. We will ask you to engage via the participant icons on your screen. So if you do want to talk, go ahead and raise your hand. If you love a point, go ahead and use the applause. And then if you want to join us on camera, please feel free. I think speakers enjoy a live audience. I know that I do, and that's the best we've got right now. So it's nice to see those faces nodding and smiling. Also, engage with us on social media during the session. We're excited to share what's happening throughout the Techlandia Summit and to get participant takeaways from our events. This session is also being recorded and will be found on TAO's YouTube channel within 24 hours of the event for our asynchronous opportunities to learn. We hope you will join us for other sessions during the Techlandia Summit 21, including 2 sessions focused on healthcare tomorrow, Tuesday, June 22nd, and our climate and environment, and then our infrastructure sessions later this week. A huge thank you to all of the investors in the Techlandia Summit. We appreciate their support and are excited to explore topics related to agriculture, healthcare, climate and environment, and infrastructure throughout this week. Comcast Business, Fortinet, Grail, and SAP. And finally, it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for this session, founder and CEO of the Provenance Network, Jeff Gauss. Jeff, the floor.
Thanks, Kara. We really appreciate that. Thanks, everybody, for showing up this morning and providing me your attention. As you heard, I'm Jeff Gauss. I'm the founder and CEO of the Provenance Chain Network. Our purpose in life as an organization is we believe human beings, people, have the fundamental right to know the facts about the products they buy, consume, and use. So our mission is to bring transparency to commerce and reveal the life cycle story of every product. Hard stop. So that's what we're working on. Today, I have a number of guests with me, and the collection of us, the 4 of us, have an announcement that's being made at the end of this session. So stay tuned for that. You'll see something that is pretty dramatic and pretty dynamic going on here in the state of Oregon. That's going to set the pace for the rest of the United States in terms of our food supply chain. But stay tuned; that'll be coming up at the bottom of, or at the top of the hour. So with that, I'd like to introduce my co-presenters. So I'm going to start with Libby Wilson. Libby, if you can take a minute and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do.
Yes, thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Libby Wilson. I work for Country Natural Beef, which is a cooperative of family ranchers. There's a little over 90 family ranchers who make up our cooperative, and we supply beef to retailers such as New Seasons, Whole Foods, and independent stores. I work on the marketing side of things, so everything from our direct consumer channels to our website to keeping in touch and reaching out to our consumers is kind of where I am. We're definitely a market-driven cooperative, so we supply based on the demands and needs of our retailers. So thanks, everyone. I'm happy to be here today.
Thanks, Libby. Todd, could you take a minute to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Todd Edmond. I'm the co-founder of Pollinate Food, and Pollinate Food is actually the pivot of Bitcorp, which has been operating as a wine distributor, which was kind of our test platform for expanding into food. What we have is logistics software and hardware platform that allows people to direct market their food products and to build their own virtualized distribution. And I was born in Eugene in 75 and have lived in Oregon most of my life, and happy to be participating in what I see as a groundswell of activity that has the ability to put us on the map for what we're doing with food.
Thanks, Todd. Jim Couples, if you can take a minute and introduce yourself.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. My name is Jim Couples, and I'm Todd's neighbor. I live in neighboring Springfield. I'm basically a technologist that really likes working with farm-related projects. Right now, my baby is a project called All the Farms. If you go to allthefarms.com and enter your address, you'll see a whole bunch of your local farms. But I spend a lot of my time, and I try to, like once a week or so in this season, being on the ground with farmers, asking them, and ranchers, dairies, everything, asking them, what the problems are, and I try to listen and respond to that. I'm also, like my co-panelist, really psyched for this attention we have on Oregon products and transparency.
Okay, well, we were talking as we started up this morning about how many of us are Zoom fatigued, and we know that normal has changed for all of us. And one of the things that we as Americans can take for granted, or have taken for granted for a long time, is that we have this abundant bounty of food. And we've taken that for granted for a long time. One would argue that a lot of the reason Americans are overweight is we have too much food. But the pandemic changed all of that. We saw the disruption in supply chains. Most Americans didn't even know what the word supply chain meant until the last 18 months. And so now there's this gigantic focus on what's going on with our supply chains. The President of the United States, President Joe Biden, has issued 2 executive orders regarding supply chains, resiliency and redundancy. And it appears as though at least the Western Hemisphere is in the process of reconfiguring our supply chains. You see it from the semiconductor manufacturing sector and what's going on there, but we also are seeing it in the food supply sector. And we're also seeing some hyperinflation. I was on the phone with some folks from the Consumer Brands Association last Wednesday night. They were speaking at Portland State University's blockchain group. And just since January, we've seen commodity prices in terms of grain up 29%, and in terms of corn, up 26%. And this has a dramatic impact. So Libby, since you're close to the ground, feet and boots on the ground in terms of the origin of a lot of the supply chain, which just one comment there, many people don't realize that 75% of the supply chains on this planet begin with either a farmer, a rancher, or a miner. So it's all dirt related and bringing it up. Libby, you're pretty close to the origin of that. Tell us what the last 18 months has been like from a supply chain perspective.
I mean, every day was different. It was at the very onset of COVID. We had a ton of team meetings with the ranchers, with our supply guys, with with the plants and everything. And it was just everyone, we didn't know what to expect. And every day it changed, and every day it was kind of constant communication of what's happening on the ranch, how those cattle then need to go to a backgrounding yard, a finishing yard. Are we full because have we been able to get, cattle harvested at plants? Do we have trucking and shipping to get to cold storage, or, to then be distributed out to retailers? And every day it was shifting and changing and really just working together. We were lucky enough that we have some really long-standing relationships and partnerships with our distributors and a lot of people we work with in the supply chain. So that was great because everyone was kind of working together to get some of those best answers to what was out there. But really, I mean, we had to be so nimble and on our feet in having to shift directions quickly, and then, figure out for the rancher, well, what does this mean for you? And how do we make sure that, we're still doing what's in the best interest of you? Because as a cooperative, that's, what our main responsibility is to do what's best for the ranchers. So I would just say it really has taught us that at a drop of the hat, we can, pivot a large ship. But it also was really nice because it also showed that when, something like this hits, consumers were just buying meat off the shelf so quickly. It was really hard for us to keep up with that retail demand, especially when labor wasn't happening at the plants or at trucking or at distribution centers. So it was kind of a little bit of tug and pull and filling in holes of, where can we fill the holes for the retailers, or how can we help the distribution centers? Are there ways that we can, ship somewhere else or change our shipping schedules to work maybe with their workforce a little bit better? But I mean, I can't say it enough. It was different every single day. It was constantly changing. And we're starting to shake out of it, luckily, and we're starting to kind of get back to normal. But I think we're going to see some long-standing effects from this for sure.
I'm going to come back to that new normal and the longstanding effects in a minute, but I want to pass it over to Jim. Jim, you're pretty close to a lot of farmers throughout the state and around the country. What have you noticed from them as a result of the pandemic?
Well, people's CSA business and other types of direct-to-consumer just blew up in a good way, right? So that was something that I think, everyone was kind of predicting that. That's not super new, but it feels like it accelerated it by 5 or 10 years. So I would say, farms looking at direct-to-consumer models, selling out CSAs, and you still see them sold out. So that's what I saw, and I mostly work with like specialty crop farms, not so big on commodities. Libby, whenever I can talk to ranchers, I like that. But that's what I saw down here in the Willamette Valley and a little bit south too. There's a few farms down in Redmond that I'll visit and keep in touch with. But CSAs blew up, and they had to pay a whole bunch more attention to their digital presence to take advantage of that opportunity. We weren't going to the supermarket to find people or products anymore. People were looking online.
For those who may not know, what is the CSA?
Sure. The CSA is Community Supported Agriculture is the acronym, and it's usually a box that you'll get once a week, anywhere from like 15 or sometimes 30 weeks, and you're paying for that. You can either pay for it. There's a couple different models, but in essence, you're giving that farm or ranch a good chunk of the money up front for the goods that they'll deliver to you throughout the growing season. It's a great deal.
So basically produce as a service.
Yep. Yeah. Wow. You might have just coined something, Jeff.
Okay. My work's done here. So, Todd, you're up next. You're pretty close to a lot of the people in the wine industry. So, and we saw wine consumption or alcohol consumption go up just a little bit during the pandemic. So what did you notice?
Yeah, I mean, for people making mass-produced wines, not so much folks in Oregon or most of the different vineyards in Oregon, but for people that produced a lot of wine, they had a great year. Everybody else is going to have challenging year unless they were really already on the ball with their DTC business. So their DTC business for a lot of wineries that did innovative things boomed last year. And I think that echoes what Jim's saying about like the growth of the direct to farm sort of models, this whole consciousness that shifted. And I think consumer consciousness is one thing that shifted during the pandemic. We wanted to become more aware about our food products. I mean, unquestionably, that is a thing that concerned us all. Where are we going to get food? Like that question, that underpinning question, when we went into the supermarket and saw things missing for the first time, became like this fundamental sounding board for how consumers shifted during the pandemic. And I think we'll see that in everything in food, wine, animal products, and in farm and agriculture for the next decade. That will concern us and consume us, I suppose.
So a couple of interesting comments in there. There was a discussion about the online ordering and the direct to consumers and spot outages and things like that. And so this points in the direction of new information technology coming into the ag supply business. And I know that the SAP folks talked about that earlier this morning. So Libby, being a producer, how does your organization take a look at the demands for new technologies and investments in technology and reconcile that with the costs of running the business, especially in light of some of the inflationary pressures that you're seeing, whether it be cost of diesel fuel, price of land, the cost of the feed commodities? How do you reconcile the technology investments?
I mean, we I'm lucky enough that we really work with some progressive, like-minded ranchers, because we are constantly looking at innovations and trying to see, what technology. I'm going back to D2C, how that blew up. I mean, we knew that that was going to be one of our initiatives in, our 3 to 5 year plan, and it just pushed it forward. So we're up there now. We're selling direct to consumer, and it's a way for one, just another, shift in how to get to consumers. But then two, we sell a lot of underutilized meats that might not be the best for the retail market necessarily, but we're finding that if we educate our consumers that way through spaces like digital and having those conversations with them, it's been really helpful. And I would say the biggest thing, that's really been affecting us is feed prices, because commodities, like you said, are going up. I mean, corn and grain, all of that's going up, which then, hurts us. And I think some of the ways we look to technology is really just optimizing what we're doing. And every ranch is different. So every ranch is going to need a little bit of something else, whether, it's figuring out, managing their rotation on their lands to make sure they're getting the best use out of their grasses and they're able to stay on, pasture for as long as they can. I think people tend to view ranchers and probably farmers as like tech phobic. They don't want to, they don't want to get into this tech land, but they do. But the problem is they want stuff that's easy. They want stuff that works. They have a million things going on in their operations every day. So they want to make sure it's not another headache. And I think our ranchers have been great because they're really open to trying new things, whether it's through, feeding and figuring out how much feed we're putting out, through our feed trucks and calculating, all the weights and the ration and the mixtures and everything, or if it's trucking and talking about the price of fuel and how we can better optimize, shipping, trucking schedules and everything. So I think this is going to push us to be even more kind of tech savvy, but I think we're ready for it. And I really think we'll be open to it on our ranching side.
And Jim, what are you seeing on the ground in terms of the how farmers are rationalizing technology investments with the cost of operating their business?
It's tough. I mean, it's a tough argument to make for people to invest in that. Last week, I was at a farmer in Junction City, and we were talking. I mean, they had amazingly antiquated machinery and technology. One of them was like a cherry pitter, and if you guys know crops, where cherry trees are all going to start to need to be harvested the next week or two, and they have to get a custom part for that. So, like technology is sensors, it's IoT and everything else, and then it's also like machinery and having to replace that stuff. So anyway, I guess my larger point, Jeff, is they've got enough problems taking care of like in a cherry pitter machine that's from 1920 and having to build a custom part for it. And then for someone like me to come on and be like, hey, let me tell you about, taking the images of your farm and putting it to blockchain, via drone or something. So it's a hard, it's a hard argument to make unless the consumer's there. And I think, that's got to start first.
You brought up a tangential but very interesting point, and that is the overall fragility of our supply chains. And the commentary that you made about the machine tooling and the manufacturing is an endemic problem now across multiple industries. You take a look at, Ford Motor Company and GM having to delay the introduction of automobiles because they're short on chips. And here, a lot of the machine tooling in this country is also sourced overseas because we allowed our manufacturing base to erode, and now we're dealing with supply or spare part supply problems. And that's going to have to be fixed. And that's one of the things that the executive order coming out of the White House is addressing. But it's probably a 10-year problem until we get all that stuff rebuilt over here or find new supply chains, whether it be in Mexico or Canada, so we don't have to depend on the oceans. But it's a pretty interesting dilemma that we're in. Todd, what are you seeing on the ground?
So what we were all talking about, I mean, we've touched on everything from how farms grow food to all the way into how it gets delivered in some form of disruption in the last year. And this is in logistics and supply chain. What we're seeing is every piece of the supply chain is been broken and then been reassembled in some way or another. Fragile is one word to describe it. And then there's another word in the industry, it's like anti-fragility, which is sort of like when things get shaken up, they get better. But these changes are so fundamental. These disruptions are so fundamental that I think it's asking a lot bigger questions about how we construct that supply chain. And so, you know, I think you're seeing this in the mergers that are happening in 3PL companies. So companies that are traditionally more focused on an individual pipeline of goods or services are now outsourcing big chunks of adjacent markets into 3PL or third-party logistics companies. And you're seeing a whole new set of business models emerge. And I don't think we've seen this type of change since probably the barcode started getting pushed up and down the supply chain in the early 80s. And I think in a lot of ways it's scary, but I also think it's going to be fundamentally good, because I believe that, you know, a lot of what happened when the barcode was introduced and that technology was introduced basically pushed expenses down the supply chain until they hit farmers. And then, you know, there's nowhere else to push it beyond that. And so you're seeing like marginal rates for crop growth and contract growing become the standard. And it gets really hard to function in farm businesses that way. And the disruption of that in farming is real. I'm sure Libby can speak to that. And the struggle of finding ways to bring your products to market is real. And I'm hoping that this shakeup actually ends up being an extremely positive thing, because it wakes us all up and says, hey, DTC business with the internet, you know, the supermarket used to be the epitome of selection and convenience for everyone. And now it's neither. We can find whatever we want on the internet and we can have it delivered to our house. And I think that we're all waking up to that, and that's going to bring about some fundamental shifts.
There's a lot to unpack in that statement, you know, and one of those ones about the anti-fragility. I tend to agree with you. You know, America, as Winston Churchill used to say, America ends up doing the right thing after it's exhausted all other possibilities. And this shakeup of our supply chains has woken us up to some of the problems that we have had, and we're starting to address those. And you talked about the small farmer, and Jim referenced that. So Libby, how do we make the small farmer or rancher, who is the predominant or preponderance of producer here in the state of Oregon? Most of the GDP in the ag sector comes from small producers. How do we make them the technology audience, and how do we get them to embrace these technological changes that are going to drive the future?
You know, I'm going back to my kind of statement of it's got to be easy and adaptable for them. I think also when we're pitching it, you know, like Jim said, you know, who am I to go tell them to do this? It's kind of a hard pitch. I think we really have to be able to show them this is how much it's going to help you, or this is, you know, the positive effects of it. This is how it's going to make your life easier, or how it's going to make you more efficient, or, you know, this is where it's going to save you some time or money. This might help you out with, you know, labor. Maybe you're going to be more efficient, so you're not going to have to pay more labor. But I think it all goes back on just making it easy and also tailoring it to them. I think sometimes a lot of these companies have these really great ideas, but they don't necessarily think of it from the producer standpoint. So it's like, it's almost there and it's almost this great thing, but they haven't taken into, you know, the day-to-day operations of a family farm and what that means to operate it. And so then, you know, the farmer is kind of like, well, this is kind of great. It doesn't really work for us. It doesn't really feel like you took, you know, our day-to-day operations into consideration. And so I think sometimes that's where you see the headbutting. So I think everyone kind of has to stop and look at it from these farmers' perspectives. I think this is one of, you know, we're getting into the generation where we're removed from farms. So some people, you know, didn't go visit their grandma and grandpa's farms. So maybe their time spent, you know, on an operation is a couple days or none. So I think everyone kind of needs to get in touch back in touch with their food supply and where things are coming from, and look at it and be like, oh, this is what they need. This is where we can help. And I think that would make all the difference in the world.
That was an interesting plug for what we're going to be talking about at the top of the hour. So thank you for that. So
Didn't even mean to, so perfect.
hey, we'll take it. So Todd, you're a technologist, and Jim, you're also a technologist. One of the things that we've encountered is, as the propeller heads come up with all these new ideas. We live in high bandwidth environments, and we sit here and, oh, everybody lives like we do. They have big monitors, and the reality is a good portion of the population does not have good access to broadband, as we learned with online schooling and how disastrous that was for many people. The infrastructure bill that Congress is debating right now has a lot of money in it for rural broadband. What are the kind of things you see impacting the ag supply chain once that is in force? Because arguably by the end of 2022, the entire planet will be covered with 5G broadband with either Starlink or the Blue Origin. There's going to be a ton of choices. What happens? So Todd, you first.
I think that the key word there is virtualization. So everything we think of as being consolidated and tied to place or physical infrastructure is and can be virtualized. So market virtualization. So when you think about how you bring products to market, that's going to be virtualized. Logistics will be virtualized, because you can start making decisions for trucks in real time and directing them in real time when there's no constraints anymore about where they're going to go, where they need to be to pick stuff up. And I think you'll see that disruption up and down the supply chain, which virtualization, when it happens, basically removes all the friction in the transaction, and it just moves the parties on the two ends of the transaction much closer to each other. That's the consumer and the producer in this case. So we're talking about the farm and the consumer. And I think that's going to net out some very positive things.
Jim, your take on that.
Yeah, broadly, I think it's going to bode very well for sustainability, regenerative ag, and those measures. Those are important to consumers. They're continuing to grow. Whole Foods just named its supplier of the year, and it was this place called Alexander Farms, which is a regenerative ag dairy. So, when I think of 5G and expanding all over, I think of data. And I think that there's less and less of an excuse for people to say that they can't transmit or, submit data that can be verified for that. So I think it'll end up being very positive, and it's going to help the push between sustainable and then, I'm really into regenerative ag, which is supposed to leave the soil in better condition. So I think there's a lot of wins that I think bode well for that.
Let's talk about something that is all over the news, especially last week and this week, and that's drought. And one can argue that regardless of your position on climate change, things are changing, right? All you got to do is take a look at a satellite map of Lake Mead and take a look at how much smaller it is. And the West was conquered by us doing some pretty heavy duty water engineering. And it's arguable that we don't have a water shortage. We just have an allocation mismatch. I don't know whether that's true or not. But Libby, when we jumped on the call this morning, you were talking about having to move some cows early, et cetera. What are you seeing with the drought, and if you have a crystal ball, what do you think is going to happen long term if this drought continues the way it's predicted?
Oh, I get me one of those crystal balls, because that would be great. But I think if this continues, it's really going to change the way we operate, in a way of, we kind of, a lot of the times we rotate because we're trying to find, we always say, we follow the grass, we follow the pasture. So when it's winter up here, we transfer down to California and it's nice. And that's where, the pasture is for great foraging and the cattle to roam on. But as that changes and we all kind of dry up at the same time, it's going to be really hard. And I think it's just going to lead to problems of finding, good, healthy pastures for our animals to graze on. And I think that's going to be something, Jim talked about regenerative ag. I think that's why it's so important now for us to figure out how to not just sustain our lands, but to make them better, to make sure that we're doing what's best for our land so that our animals can continue to get the best nutrients and food source that they need, whether that's in Eastern Oregon or if it's in California or Colorado. I think it's super important because we don't know what's going to happen, but we know that the water and the drought it's here to stay. It's sticking around. It's going to be a problem. We're consistently seeing it becoming drier and hotter. And it's going to be a huge problem for all these ranchers and farmers that are trying to find good pasture, whether it's for growing crops or feeding animals.
It's interesting because what I heard from some of the comments that Todd made and that Jim made, and now hearing from you, it sounds like one of the better innovations that could come along is to provide more accurate and more timely demand and supply signals back and forth across the network, a network between consumer and producer. And it also sounds to me as though we could start to use a lot of IoT stuff. I don't know how many of you know the folks down at the Freshwater Trust in Portland. There's a guy there who's a former Morgan Stanley bond trader, and they're actually working on the tokenization, so cryptocurrency tokenization of water rights, so that we can more accurately price the cost of water and allocate it a little bit better. So I think that you're going to see some interesting developments over time. I'm going to start on this round with Todd. What's the biggest and coolest tech innovation that you've seen in ag tech?
The biggest and coolest technology innovation in ag tech. No, I think unquestionably the technology that is yet to really be realized in ag tech is blockchain for me, and that's something that, like, to be able to tie something to where it was made and traced all the way through the supply chain is a massive advantage to the types of companies that I really want to choose their products from. So I'm a homegrown guy, and I like products that are grown around here. And I also know from my time as an economist that when you start aggregating up massive amounts of product, the case of lettuce, right? Almost all of lettuce is grown in one area of California. We have 149,000 acres planted to lettuce in the entire United States. 95% of that is in one area in California. When you start doing that, that has these massively bad impacts on, they're basically, the large companies are aggregating or externalizing that down to farmers and the environments and a bunch of different things to make that a tenable deal. And I think when people can start looking at individual products that they're purchasing and be aware of place and production and composition, and even be able to get to a log of how much carbon footprint was spent bringing this product to where it is, people can start making actual rational decisions around the climate as a consumer, which that just has not been available to us. And I think how that all gets implemented, how it all gets rolled out, doesn't matter as much as it needs to absolutely happen as soon as possible. And I think these are the ways in which, when people talk about, pay attention to your carbon footprint, we need ways to pay attention to a carbon footprint so that we can do something about it, right, as consumers. So I think that's the biggest change. And unfortunately, in some ways I'm playing in a home court here with the people who are participating, but I really do feel that's the case.
That was also an unsolicited endorsement for what we're going to talk about here in a couple minutes. So thank you for that. Jim, how about you? What do you see as the biggest technology that is going to impact ag tech?
For me, it's probably when I look at the potential for buying carbon credits through farming and ranching and agriculture. There's a startup called Nori in Seattle. They've been doing a lot of that. So that to me is really interesting and promising because it's not so much that specific company, but who they're mostly selling those carbon credits to are big time blue chip companies. And that's who we need to get on board and start paying for things to make things move. I want to circle back to one other thing though, because you're talking about water rights and tokenization of them. A few years ago, I work a lot with OSU, just doing like pilot projects. I really love working with them. We were going to do a looking at water rights and getting that information actually onto blockchain. And this was in 2018, and we started asking around. This is a very Oregon problem. And there's people called water masters, and they decide, or they know who has the rights, and they say when water gets turned off. And when I had spoken to them, as I was doing research on this project, they were saying like the cannabis growers were like the bane to their existence, because a lot of them were black market and they're using a lot of water. And when things get scarce, that's when we fight. So, that's an issue. That's a very Oregon issue.
Well, based on climate change models, it's going to be an issue for every part of the United States except for the Great Lakes region and the Pacific Northwest. So Southern Oregon will continue to have water rights issues, but let's stay tuned to that. Libby, what's the biggest technology advance that you're seeing that's going to impact ag?
Well, both Jim and Todd those are great ones. And I'm also really excited for it, but just coming, because I am rancher focused and coming from being, 6th generation rancher, I think the biggest thing is figuring out how to log data from the birth of our cattle all the way through. I think that is going to be, and just, all of our animals. And I think that's going to be huge. So it does kind of tie into that blockchain, but it also has an element of being able to flip that around and share with our consumers. Because I just think that is going to be so important as the conscious consumer really grows. And whether, that's Bluetooth implants that's tracking, everything from heart rate to activity to what they're eating, or, some blockchain systems. I just think these are going to be things that are so exciting, and they're going to help us so much. And they're really going to help people reconnect with their food and be able to make that conscious decision of, what is my carbon footprint? Or is this really healthy? Or is this really as health conscious or eco-conscious as I thought it was? And I think with some of this popping up, I think it's really going to be able to kind of wash away those brands and companies that are saying they're doing this, but maybe they're not really doing it. And I think that's also just going to help the ag industry overall, because together we're going to be able to say, here are all the things we're doing. We're not this villain out here, not paying attention to the environment, because that's just not true. We really are stewards of the land. And so I think some of this stuff, especially being able to really track our cattle and our animals and figure out, how to raise them the best way, so they're not getting antibiotics, so they can feed into these never ever programs. We'll be able to see with some of this, Bluetooth implant technology, are they starting to get sick? Are they showing, signs of this? Are they distressed? We're going to be able to figure out how they're functioning in their environment to just overall create a better and healthier food supply. So.
Thank you for that. So last Wednesday at the Portland State Blockchain conversation was part of the grad school program. This woman, her name is Roberta Wagner, and Roberta Wagner was the #2 person in the FDA's Office of Food Safety for 20 some years. So she's very familiar with a lot of the issues. And one of the statements that she made on the call was that the ag industry, while we are arguably the most productive agricultural industry on the planet by leaps and bounds, that we are woefully inadequate or way behind the times in the adoption of technology. True or false? Todd?
I would say that the ability and the fluidity with which farmers can adopt technology, and that technology is built for them, that is absolutely true. And it's because that a lot of the innovation and stuff that's driven the agricultural supply chain was never built or intended for the normative, the most common farmer. 90% of food, 90% of food is produced by what you classify as a smaller farm. They're not the big agro farms, but yet all the technology is in our geography and what's being pushed up and down the supply chain is for the big guys. And so I think that is true, but with a caveat on whose fault it is.
So whose fault is it?
It's largely the supply chains. So when you look at the United States, Walmart sets the price for groceries. Fundamentally, they're growing contracts. No one else, when they go into an area instead of growing contracts for products, they are beginning to dictate the price of those groceries. And so because they dictate the price of the groceries, if you're a supplier, food processor, food wholesaler, and you want to work with Walmart, your first concern is meeting the terms of your penalized based Walmart contract. And so everything that gets put in place in the supply chain largely is to take whatever you're doing, make sure you can meet your Walmart contract that is, the biggest customer of yours by far. And then you figure out a way to kick that cost down the supply chain. So you'll adopt things that address that concern, which is helping me meet Walmart's demand. So I tag up with RFID or whatever it is that Walmart wants. But that kind of cripples your ability to adopt other technologies.
I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Jim, your thoughts on that? True or false, ag is very woefully inadequate in the adoption of technology.
Yeah, it's both. I mean, you're gonna find, people that have access to the best agronomists and the biggest operations, and they're fully digital. And they're ready to, they're ready to recall things a lot quicker. Walmart's been moving in that direction as far as putting products on blockchain for years now, probably like 3 years or so since they announced that they were putting their leafy greens on there. So yeah, it's lopsided. And, just, I want to speak to that. I think like understanding that it's lopsided, that the technology helps efficiencies. Well, like if we're conscious of all that and we think this through, and we have to come to the decision of like, well, do we value our small farms and want them to be efficient and stay in business, or do you want like one gigantic farm and everywhere? And if the answer is that it's in our public interest, well, then like we've got to do a little bit to make that adoption by those non-gigantic farms to be able to adopt this technology, right? So we have to really think it through. I mean, it's no secret that the biggest farms have the most technology and they have the people that can do that. But if you talk to any of the small local farms, they're not there. They mostly have DTC, but they're not really ready at this stage for other technology like getting into IoT or sensors. If we value them and you want them to compete, well, then we should think of ways to do that collectively.
And Libby, you as a producer, we started with you talking about how you rationalize technology, and let's come at it from the other end. True or false? That your industry is a laggard in terms of the adoption of technology.
I agree that it's very lopsided, because I think we do have some big ag that are doing some amazing things with technology, but I think it's really hard for our smaller family farms to adopt it. And I go back to, because how useful is it for them? How purposeful is it from their point of view? And I think, a little bit of their resistance is because maybe it doesn't fit them. And so I think we need to do a better job of figuring out what their needs and how to help them do it. And then also just the accessibility and the expense, of it. Again, figuring out when do you make that investment and when do you not. So I think it's, it's lopsided. It's true, but I really think we're going to get better at it, and we're going to get there, especially as the next generation comes in, which is something we've seen with our cooperative already, is, some of that next generation who we grew up with technology. We grew up with our iPhones, we're on our screens all the time, and they're coming in and we're thinking of, how can we adopt this technology going far beyond just direct consumer, being out in the digital space. So I think, I definitely think we're lagging, but I think we are coming into this moment where we're ready to invest and to get on board and to push the limits. I think, and of course I'm biased because I do come from the ranch side, but I think that sometimes we we forget about the day-to-day operations and what it takes to work, and we just want to force something on them, and we can't do that. They have enough going on every day. We can't force it. We need to figure out how it can all be worked together. And I think if we can kind of figure out that balance, I think it's going to be great. And I think small farmers will adapt to it and will take advantage of it, because they're seeing the necessity and they're seeing the positive impacts of it as well.
Thank you for that. So a couple threads got woven together there. And so one was the lopsidedness and, the Walmart driving things, and arguably Walmart is the organization, I'm not picking on them, but arguably they're the organization that drove the globalization of our supply chains, with bringing stuff in from China, low cost all the day, all the time. And it helped our economy quite a bit for quite a while. But then you have the whipsaw effect of that. And we've seen it in the last year, specifically with Uyghur cotton. And a lot of people, you don't necessarily think about cotton as an agricultural product, because we're so far removed from the farms and our supply chain. But cotton is a pretty significant staple that we here in this country use a lot of. We're also one of the largest growers of it, but the Uyghurs have been arguably forced into slave labor to produce that cotton. And it's very difficult for an American consumer to know without reservation where their cotton is coming from, because of a lack of transparency in the supply chain. And we're now starting to see the same thing with leather, responsibly raised leather, with the people for the ethical treatment of animals, et cetera. And so it's in that light, and this is where I'm going to shift into the announcement on behalf of the state of Oregon and the group here. Some number of years ago, as a result of a Technology Association of Oregon event, it was an event called Blockchain in Healthcare that I attended in 2017. I set out on a quest to establish a blockchain center of excellence here in the state of Oregon. So we went off and created this entity called the Oregon Enterprise Blockchain Venture Studio. It was backed by the governor's office, the treasurer's office, the Technology Association of Oregon, some of our largest businesses, in Portland State University, who actually constructed a major both at the undergraduate and graduate level in blockchain. And that's underway. We've been nurturing companies, and you're starting to see some percolation effects from that. One of which is my company, the Provenance Chain Network. We grew out of that. You heard our mission at the beginning of that. So over the last several months, we decided to step forward and push this issue really, really hard. And so today, and I'll share my screen so you can see the website. You can go there, and it should be live. Can everybody see my screen, the website? So today we're announcing the Oregon Transparency Initiative, and this is the entire state of Oregon's agricultural and food supply chain stepping forward and saying we are, in fact, the most transparent food supply chain on the planet. It's a first step for all of our industries, but we're starting with food and beverage for a number of reasons. All three of the participants on the call here are participating in that initiative, either from a producer level or from a technology support level. But we're starting out with our largest brands: Tillamook Cheese, A to Z Wine Works, Dutch Bros, Ninkasi Brewery, and several others are stepping forward saying we are, in fact, going to start providing this information so that when the conscious consumer does get into the grocery store with the appropriate technology services, he or she will have the ability to determine, is there Roundup in my food supply chain? What is the water impact? What is the energy impact on this? How are those farmers being treated? Do they have the right kind of social contract with the employees in the field, et cetera, so that the consumer can determine whether or not they're willing to pay an extra $2 for a t-shirt because of the social impact of that. So Libby, Jim, and Todd, I appreciate your support for this initiative, and I know that the entire state of Oregon is going to be welcoming this. So with that, I'm going to open it up to the audience for any questions. You can either turn on your cameras and raise your hand, do the hand signal, text the questions in. Love to hear your thoughts and comments on that. I'm going to call on you, Alex, because you're deep in the bowels of this. Tell me what you think.
I have tons of thoughts. I wanted to jump in on like 3 or 4 of the questions. I messaged Kara. I was like, you should have added me to the panel. I'd love to. I have all sorts of things to say.
First off, let everybody know who you are and what you do.
Yeah, no, so I'm Alex Parascavas. I work for a nonprofit regional economic development organization called SEDCOR. We cover Marion, Polk, and Yamhill County. And we landed, an EDA grant to build the Northwest Ag Innovation Hub. And so we're all about trying to bring farmer-centric product development to the Willamette Valley and to the region. Just to exactly what Libby was talking about. People are like, oh yeah, you should have all these technologies that we should, but I've never been to a farm before. And so I don't actually understand how any of it works. And so, this technology might be great in the, theoretically, but in reality, how does that work? And so we're trying to bring a model to the region that focuses on using farmers and a farmer network to assess new technologies, or like pre-commercial, and do field trials, farm trials, and then kind of pick the winners and then help implement those things. And so I think I have become a diehard, passionate advocate for Oregon agriculture. So my soapbox is, every Oregonian should be proud of what we grow and the way we grow it. And Oregon Ag does a bad job of advocating for itself, I would say. And so it's up to us to really carry the water on that and tell that story. And so I was kind of jumping up and down when you're like, yeah, we have to use farmers to help actually do the product development, because there are tons of them that are early adopters, tons of them that actually are interested in this stuff, but you have to figure out how to grease the wheels. And you have a regulatory environment and sort of an economic environment that's driving economies of scale and vertical integration and all this stuff, and it's getting harder and harder. So yeah, this is my passion point at this point, like professionally and personally. And I actually just got appointed to the Beef Council for State of Oregon, so the Commodity Commission, because why not? Got other, I don't have enough things to do. So anyway, I'm sorry, I don't mean to hijack this, but I think this kind of stuff is really, really cool, but it's all about implementation to me at a farm level and figuring out how it doesn't interfere and doesn't become, like, my preaching point is, every farmer is already economist, meteorologist, marketing, communications, HR, mechanic, you pick. And so adding data scientist or something else on top of that becomes too much of a burden, I would say. And so making it simple and making it easy and implementable and using data that already exists is kind of the one thing that we've been talking about, with Jim and Kara, for sure. We've had these conversations around that. So anyway, sorry for the monologue. I appreciate letting me take the time.
Well, we welcome you to the OTI. If you're willing to participate, we'd love to have you.
Absolutely.
Anybody else? Kara, I know you usually are not at a loss for words.
I was just going to say, when does Alex have any spare time? With the OTI, where do you see, at what point, I guess is the question, do you see other states really looking to us? Because I one of the things I've learned from working with Alex in this Northwest Ag Innovation Hub is and Todd mentioned it, we feel unique because we're a lot of small farms, but that's the reality of most of the country. And then particularly, when we look at the U from Washington down along the base to my home state where they grow some pecans, if you're from Georgia, and then back up to Maine. Where do you start seeing some of that traction? Because I think it would be super cool for Oregon to be leading those conversations, because I don't know that most of America thinks about their specialty crops.
So a couple comments there, and one is that most technology gets adopted for one of two reasons. One is either because it is just so life-changing from either a cost or efficiency perspective that you can't live without it. The other reason that technology is often adopted is because of regulatory impetus. And I think that there's going to be a combination of those two as the Gen Zs interact with the regulatory environment of, we have the right to know this stuff. And either, you are going to vote with wallets and I'm not going to buy your stuff anymore because you're not transparent, or the federal government or some regulatory body saying you must release this information. That's inevitable. And it's just a question of how it's done. And one of the lines I used when I was convincing the state to get behind the blockchain initiative was that this technology is going to happen. It's inevitable. The only question you have to answer is it going to happen to you, or is it going to happen because of you? And so this is the Oregon food and beverage industry stepping forward and saying, we're going to allow it to happen because of us. And Oregon actually has a very long history of this. We, as Peter Courtney, our our Senate president, talks about, Oregon's often either the first or the only that does something. We were the first that introduced a fuel tax as a way to fund highways. Now it became a national standard. We were one of the first to allow marijuana, assisted suicide. I don't know whether that's good or bad, but we do take some pretty progressive stances on things. And we have a very strong food culture. I mean, the whole foodie culture, the Portlandia episode about Colin the chicken, and somewhat tongue in cheek, but it's pretty real. And so why not take that ethos that we have as a state? To your point, Alex, we're really proud about what we produce. This is one of the few states in the country that can feed itself if we had to. Very few states can say that. So why don't we take that whole ethos and promote that as a way for national standards to be adopted? And if you know anything about standards, which I've done some work developing protocols and standards, they usually start out as a tactical deployment that then grow up into a bigger strategic initiative. And that's really what the Oregon Transparency Initiative is about, is starting to set some standards. So I'll pause to see who else has some questions. I saw some questions in the chat.
There is one in the chat. I'm curious what the customer experience looks like. Will each product, i.e. block of Tillamook cheese, have a unique identifier a consumer can look up on blockchain? That's the first question. What metadata would be associated with that item? And then you mentioned carbon cost. What else are you thinking?
Okay, so I have to be very careful here because the Provenance Chain Network is a for-profit entity, and we have developed a lot of this technology. It's up and running. One of the customers of it is here on the phone or here on the line with us. There's a couple things. So first off, the eventual result of this whole movement, whether it's done with the Provenance Chain Network or not, is that every product on the planet will have a unique identifier of some form at some point in time. Today, there's a UPC, which is a universal product code, barcode that's on every product. That tells you what the product is, 12-ounce block of cheese. It does not specifically reference the 12-ounce block of cheese that's being held in your hand. That's called serialization. That serialization is something that is happening. You start to see it in very expensive products like automobiles. There's a VIN number. That's a serialized identifier of that car. The technology exists that we could do that with every food product that we have today. It's just that it's a little bit expensive, and the data systems are such that it is not easy to do. But there are movements afoot coming out of the FDA that are suggesting that that's going to be a requirement some point in the future. And the reason for that is when Walmart has to pull romaine lettuce off the shelf because it has listeria in it, or there's a scare of it, without serialization, they have to pull all of the product off the shelf. And that's very, very expensive from a food waste perspective. So to answer the author's question here, yes, there will be a unique identifier for every product. That's already started in some instances. There's a product on the market today. It's called Smart Label. It's an item that is owned by a combination of the Food Marketing Institute and the Consumer Brands Association. But what it releases is allergen information, that this particular product, it was made in a factory that had peanuts, et cetera. It doesn't go to the depth of some of these other things. The work that the PCN and the blockchain researchers that we've been doing are taking into account all of the factors that you heard me talk about before, which is water usage, carbon footprint, the treatment of the labor force, the benefits that are provided to the workers, what is the custodial effects on the agricultural land, all the way through the supply chain out to the retailers, and also allergen information, et cetera. And it's going to be what's disclosed is going to be governed by a combination of what companies are promoting as their disclosure, as well as what the regulatory agencies are requiring people to do. So here's how competition comes into play. So Country Natural Beef is all pasture raised, organic. It's about as pure as you can get from a beef perspective. They're going to promote that. There are going to be other people that don't want consumers to really know all of the truth about how the meat is handled or grown. What happens in a competitive environment? There will be people that will say, I'll take the low price. There will be other people that will say, I'll pay more because of. And then the laws of economics will be the ones who bear that out. And last, so I talked about carbon cost, and then there's, oh, somebody's talking about pecan. Okay, pecan versus pecan. Good, I get that. So it's one of my favorite pies, by the way, Kara. So you can make me one anytime you want. So.
I know I can buy you one, Jeff. That's
Oh,
what
okay.
Hey, Jeff, can I mention something really quick?
Absolutely.
We're cutting close to time, so I want to mention something about this effort for the Oregon Transparency Initiative. I was listening to someone talk the other day about what creates the scenario for like race to the bottom, and it is a variance of quality, and then the other element is a lack of transparency. And you can't really stop like the variance of quality, because some people are going to grow things differently or raise them differently. But one of the things that you can do is you can create transparency. And by doing this, we kind of put the brakes on race to the bottom. And we've been forcing farmers and ranchers and people that work at dairies into that race to the bottom mindset because of the lack of transparency. So, I'm a fan, as you know, and I'm excited for what we're going to do.
So with that, I think we're a wrap. Kara, I'm going to hand it back to you to do any final closing comments. But to my fellow panelists, thank you very much for the conversation here today. More importantly, thank you for stepping forward in this vision to make Oregon's food supply chain the most transparent on the planet. Looking forward to the journey.
Thank you all so much. Thanks for kicking off our day. Thanks for hanging with us on Zoom. We'll get out the video and y'all can share it with your networks. We really appreciate it. And then everyone give Jim a holler down there on his email. He just shared it with everyone. And we look forward to seeing anybody that's interested in the healthcare session starting tomorrow at 9 with our keynote. And in the meantime, if you are in the great state of Oregon, stay cool. If you are not, enjoy the weather wherever you are. And don't forget to thank a local producer at some point in the next couple of days. Right,
Yeah,
Alex?
beef, it's what for dinner, especially country natural beef. So, how's that, Libby? So.
Perfect. Thanks for the plug.
Y'all have a great day. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.